Weight balance is extremely important for the handling of the car, and on the X4 it's not an exception. So we're gonna cover some of the things that you should think about when you place the weights on the car, and how you can make the car as balanced as possible, not only between left and right, but also between front and rear. And we're also going to talk about the difference in handling when you change the weight bias between front and rear. So first of all, we need to see what kind of electronics we have in the car, because this varies, of course, depending on the racing class and the electronics used. If you use handout electronics, or you can choose to use your own electronics. So since I'm racing in the modified class, I'm using quite normal electronics on the left side of the car, and normal long type of battery on the right side of the car, but it's not a super heavy battery. This battery only weighs 245 grams, so it's fairly light, so we're not going to need that much weight to compensate for the weight of the battery, which you might need in the stock classes where you use very heavy batteries sometimes. And that may need a compensation in weight to be added on the left side to compensate for how heavy the battery is. But in this case it's not needed because this is quite light. But the first thing that I can recommend to install is the optional tungsten weight, which goes into the chassis slot on the right side. And it's really convenient to use because it's a very low point of the car where you can add weight, so it doesn't really affect the weight balance or affect the CG very much at all. Quickly gonna install this in the car. So what do I use to fixate this into the car? I use hoodie thin double-sided tape. And it's important to use a thin tape for this weight, because if not, it will not fit into the slot and it will protrude above the chassis. So you want to use the thinnest possible tape that you can. In this case, the hoodie tape. Just install this here. And then we're gonna put this on the chassis here. See, it fits perfectly into the slot here, and it's perfectly flat thanks to the very thin tape. And that's step number one. I mostly recommend to run that weight there. Okay, so how can we know that the car is balanced between left and right? You can use these hoodie balancing tools, these little pins. They're a bit simple, but they actually work really well for this purpose. And they can give you a quick answer if the car is out of balance or if it's well balanced. So you need to install these into the little holes on the chassis, which are specifically made for these pins. At each end of the chassis you have one hole to put these pins inside. Okay, now we can check the balance from left to right. So let's see if it can stay balanced. It stays fairly balanced. When it's balanced on the pins like this, it seems a little left heavy because it wants to tip over a bit to the left. So that means that we might need to add a little bit of weight to the right, towards the right side of the car. But keep in mind that we still haven't installed the battery mounting system yet, so that should mean that we have a bit of weight still to be added to the right side of the car. Okay, let's move on to see what we can do with adding more weights. We also have something new and really nice on the X4, which is these brass nickel coated weights, which they all attach straight to the motor mount in the center of the car. So the benefit of having these weights is that you can mount them on the motor mount directly with screws, no tape needed. And the benefit of having weight right in the center of the car is that it doesn't affect the weight balance of the car or the weight bias. It simply adds weight as close to the center of the car as possible. And since the car is pretty light and you normally need to add weight to make the minimum weight rule for races, it's a really convenient way to add weight in a really low and central spot. So I'm going to demonstrate how you can use these weights. So in this case, I'm just going to add weights to the front side of the motor mount, but you can use these brass nickel coated weights also at the back of the motor mount, so at both sides of the motor mount. But I'm just going to install 2 of them. They come with these little 2.5mm screws, which are specifically made for these. And these are really easy to install here. We just slide them into place. And they are fixated with 1 screw. So these option parts are really highly recommended, and they really fit the car in the best possible spots. We also have 1 little weight which we can mount here in front of the spur gear. And there they are, they're fitted onto the car. 1 weight in front of the spur and 1 at the back of the spur. Look how nice that looks, and we have added quite a bit of weight in a good spot. Okay, so let's talk about weight bias for a minute. It's a very sensitive thing for the handling of the car, how we put the weights in terms of bias. So do we want the car to be 50-50 balanced, the same amount of weight in the front as in the rear, or do we want it to be biased towards one direction? This depends on the handling of the car and what kind of handling we're trying to achieve. It's true that the X4, it really seems to work well with more weight towards the rear of the car compared to the T4. And it's much easier to drive in terms of handling as a platform. So you can get away with adding more weight to the rear of the car and still having the car really easy to drive. Because when you add weight to the rear of the car, you improve rotation. The car will have more cornering speed, but it will be more difficult to drive, typically. So more rear weight bias, such as 49-51 or even 48-52, will improve rotation a lot, but it will make the car more difficult to drive. So the best basic setting is usually 50-50, or if the grip is high enough and you need more rotation, move weight to the rear. For very high grip conditions and conditions where you're struggling with traction rolling or a very loose rear, you can consider to add more weight to the front, such as 51-49 or weight bias. And how do we check the weight bias? The best way to check it is by using these aftermarket scales, individual scales for all 4 corners. So you put the car on these scales, and you can get a reading on your phone or on your separate station that connects the weights, and you can see the load on each tire. And this has to be done after the car has been tweaked, which we'll go through later, the chassis tweak. But the weight bias is a very important part of the setup, and is something that you should always take a look at and consider when you're making your setup. So, if we want to add more weight to the rear of this car, then how can we do that? We have several options. For example, we have these hoodie tungsten weights, which are super nice. I'm just gonna demonstrate one of them. They are made in tungsten, so that means that they're very dense, very small and low weights, but with quite a lot of weight. So the use of the tungsten material has many benefits. I'm gonna install one of these weights at the back of the car. I'm just going to install this right in the center line of the car here, below the belt, because we're not using the T-brace in this car. And something else that I can recommend is the hoodie precision balancing weights, which are screwed onto the car. These are 10-gram weights, and they can be screwed onto the chassis. We also offer these in the new tungsten version, which is also really nice. So these can just be screwed onto the car here in the back. You don't have to use tape to fixate these. For example, you can install one here at the back of the chassis. And I think that's enough for a start, but I'm gonna install one more of these weights here in the back. We're going for a bit of a rearward weight balance on this car because it's a modified car that I'm building for a bit higher grip tracks. And moving these weights around will have a significant impact on the weight bias. So just moving 5 grams from the rear of the car to the front can have a massive impact, can make 1% difference in weight bias, which doesn't sound much, but it's really gonna have a big impact on the handling. So I hope that I've given you some useful pointers in terms of weight balance, and that you can use this information to tune your car accordingly.